See Judge Act as a theological method, and we have discussed last Tuesday specifically about some of the suggestions and the challenges that Father Pilario has made in regard to the three steps, what to do. But actually, what he was trying to do would be more like put it in a much more progressive way of understanding the See Judge Act methodology. Anyway, this was what we have done in terms of the last part, See Judge Act. What I would like to do today, well, very briefly about the method of as contextualization as brought up by Melba Padilla Magay. I have asked you to read her article on contextualization, and I think it's a very well written. By the way, she writes very well and very clearly, and she's one of the more distinguished Protestant theologians here in the Philippines. And you can see from her article that she is pretty authoritative. It's a good person. But also, as I discuss this method on contextualization, because it really talks about culture, I like to inform you that there will be a separate SVST course on theology and culture. I think you will have it in the second semester under Father Danny Pilario or somebody else, but it will be under Father Danny Pilario. So you will have an extensive discussion on the relationship between theology and culture. And I think you will learn a great deal from him. But when we start talking about contextualization, we just need to understand that contextualization is a process by which we bring into the present context what was received earlier, of course, appreciated in its own context and not taken out of its own context, so that it becomes something that is concrete, something that is living, something that makes us that is meaningful for us at this time in our life. In other words, the truth that was being revealed and received would be something meaningful, and that is basically what contextualization, the process of contextualization, is all about. Okay, now how do we contextualize? I think you are familiar with the fact that one of the most common ways of bringing something from the past into our present is by way of either of translation or adaptation. Of course, you know that when we translate, we actually will simply use the same words that we find in the, let's say, in the Nicene Creed, and then translate it into our own language, meaning English, Spanish, French, Italian, Filipino, Vietnamese, whatever, Papua, Pidgin English, all that. There would be translation. But the text basically remains the same. You will remember, of course, that before, I don't know if you remember, we used to talk about the homoousios, the concept of homoousios in the Creed. We used to translate it into English as one in being. You probably much earlier knew about this translation, one in being with the Father. Jesus Christ was one in being with the Father. And then there was a certain reform of the English translation, and instead of using one in being, they used the word consubstantial, because according to the translator, according to the group that allowed this translation, that consubstantial is much more faithful translation to what is the Latin word, which is consubstantialis. Consubstantialis. So that is basically what they had used as a translation of the word homoousios, which is the Greek word, or consubstantialis, which is the Latin word. Okay, so basically translation is a very minimal kind of an contextualization. You're only contextualizing it in your own language. Practically, you are just using a Google translation. And sometimes, I don't know if you have experienced it, but some Google translations are not as accurate because they are what they call this mechanized kind of a translation. So Sometimes it doesn't have any rhythm, it doesn't have any grammar, it just translates the words. Okay, that is what translation is, and it is a form of contextualization. The other form of contextualization is what we would call adaptation. You adapt by what they call this finding a kind of an equivalent, a kind of a symbolic equivalent in your own culture. So, for example, whereas when we talk about the Eucharist, we talk about bread in the time of Jesus and maybe even the European cultures. But here, bread would not be something that is a staple food here in this country, or this part of Asia. We are much more familiar with rice as the staple food for all peoples here. So, is it possible, therefore, to change from bread into rice? Okay, is it possible to say the bread, instead of saying bread of life, you are the rice of life? Or as you well know, in Tagalog, we have different words for rice. It depends on whether it is raw or it is cooked rice. How do you say the cooked rice? Kanin, right? How do you see the raw rice? The one
Bigas.
that was this, right? Huh?
Bigas.
Bigas,
Bigas.
Charot.
bigas is already something that is what do you call this? It is already removed. They removed the husk already. Remember, but before that, before how do you say rice with the husk?
Palay.
Palay.
Palay, palay, bigas, kanin. So three different words. So which one are we going to use for the bread of life? Is it bigas or kanin? It's probably kanin.
Kanin.
Anyway, anyway, what they are trying to say is that here you're trying to adapt a symbol which was culturally bound, like the bread or the wine, bread or wine, and then you try to put it in the cultural framework, symbolic framework, let's say of Asia, and would you say rice, or in the case of wine, what would you put? Sake, if you are what they call Japanese, or if you are Vietnamese, what kind of tea or coffee? Is that what is the equivalent of the wine? So that is what adaptation was is trying to do. So many people, of course, did not think it in the same way. Contextualization is more than just translation or adaptation. Because what we find really in translation and adaptation is that it is assuming that the truth that is revealed or is expressed is unchanging, that it is what it was in the time of Jesus, what it was during the time of, let's say, the early years of Christianity, what it was during the Middle Ages, and what it was during the time of the Reformation, of the Council of Trent, and then what it is mostly in Western Church, the Latin Church. So it's not in the Oriental Church or the Asian Church. So that is the criticism that they had labeled against this type of contextualization. It's a very superficial. You're just trying to find a superficial equivalent. Of course, in the translation, people will say we should look for a dynamic equivalent. But that is a problem with having a dynamic equivalent, because what we sometimes think is a dynamic equivalent, according to some people, is really quite different. I will tell you honestly my own experience about even about translation. I can tell you very honestly that when people translated the mass into Bicol, they'll translate it into the Bicol of Naga, which is not the same as the Bicol of Sorsogon, at least of Bulan and Gubat. They are not the same Bicol. So I always rebel against the Bicol of what do you call this, of Naga, because in my opinion, that is not the language that the people in Bulan, the people in Gubat, in that part of Sorsogon, speak. We speak a different kind of a Bicol. So what is the language that we really want to translate into? The ultimate goal, of course, of translation is that people are able to understand what is being spoken, and people are able to actively participate in the celebration itself. If you do not know that language, if you are not familiar, if it is not your mother tongue, how can you participate actively in this particular kind of celebration? Unless, of course, you get to learn it. Like most of us, we learn English So when we have English liturgy, we are able to understand English. But I can imagine, of course, the difficulty that, for example, our Vietnamese brothers and sisters, our Indonesian and our Indian, what do you call this, sisters, they probably would have great difficulty in trying to adapt even English itself. How much more if it is in Latin? Very difficult to understand because it is something that is in a way foreign to the culture. So this is a critique of this kind of contextualization simply by translation or by adaptation. It remains on the level of what is exterior. It does not concern itself with the core of the message. In other words, and people do not want to change it or to simply stay on the level of translation or adaptation because they are afraid that if we try to put it so much into the level of our culture, we might lose something about what they call the essence, or the core of the message. And that is something that is, of course, a danger. It's a possible danger. Now, uh, Magai basically, from a communication theory, speaks about a ladder of abstraction. Because when we talk about contextualizing something, the core message of a particular, let's say, a revealed truth, contextualizing it in our own context, in our own experience, is something that is difficult to do. But we can observe this very clearly according to this communication theory. For example, when we speak about globalization, it's a very general term. But then, from the point of view of economics, we start talking about economics without borders. Of course, globalization is not just economics, it's also political, it's also cultural, it's all kinds of things. It's as well as spiritual. Okay. But from the point of view of economics, this will be economics without borders. And that's why we have something like the World Trade Organization, WTO, that everybody is supposed to understand in the same way how economics work in the world, especially in this global world. But going it further into smaller, but we speak of globalization as another form of multinationalism. In other words, many nations coming together or several nations coming together. Not just one nation or not just one region, let's say in Asia, but many nations coming together, agreeing on certain principles. So, but if you want to make it a little bit more specific, then we say McDonald's. Then we understand when people say McDonald's, because McDonald's is found everywhere. When you say McDonald's in Indonesia, you will have what they call is the same McDonald's that you would find in other places, except maybe in terms of the taste. Maybe it's much more spicy in Indonesia than it is in the Philippines or in what do you call this in the U.S. or in Europe. But when you say McDonald's, you have a very specific object that you are familiar with. But that particular object has already been, in a way, contextualized in its own proper context. So, and I remember one time when was going through, I went to Indonesia and we went to McDonald's, not McDonald's, but KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken. And so we ordered chicken, or just the usual fried chicken, Kentucky Fried Chicken. When they came out, chicken was very, very spicy because that was the most common of the Indonesian way of preparing chicken, very spicy chicken. So we had to ask the cook to cook something that is less spicy. So unless you what they call is you properly specify, you may get exactly what is already being prepared for the majority of the population. So according to this ladder of abstraction, the higher the level of abstraction, the more abstract and the more universal. But the lower the level of abstraction, the more concrete and the more specific. So in terms of contextualization, we will go for the less, as much as possible, less abstract as possible. Make it more concrete, make it more specific. And that is why people were talking about, instead of saying bread of life, you talk about the rice of life or something, because it's much more specific and people are able to identify with it because they know exactly what is the meaning of having or eating rice for them. So I think we need to bear this in mind, because that is always the tendency, especially among people who have studied philosophy or theology or something that is very metaphysical or very, very academic. They tend to be more abstract, they tend to be more universalist in their speech, in their language, and they end up, what you call is, speaking to only a very few portion of the population, because not everybody is able to speak in that language, in an abstract, universal kind of language. The language of Jesus, for example, is so concrete that even the fishermen and the farmers and the ordinary people will be able to understand, because he was speaking in terms of parables. But at the same time, he was conveying a very important message, the message of the kingdom of God. And how did he explain it? Explain it through parables. The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. The kingdom of God is like a sower who went out to sow seeds, etc. The kingdom of God is like a woman who lost a particular coin, or a particular pearl or something like that. So that was how he was explaining. So he was explaining things in a very concrete way. If he can do it, if we can imitate Jesus, then I think we will be contextualizing the message of Jesus in a way that would be understood by our people, in the way that would facilitate, of course, the faith of people. So Magai speaks about contextualization from within. What do we need to do when we talk about contextualization from within? First, we analyze. We analyze our language, our symbols. And here she offers a kind of example, sala or kasalanan, which is the translation for sin in Tagalog. But sala in kasalanan in what do you call this, in our own language, is not quite as serious as sin, the connotation of sin in the in let's say Western language or in the English language. Sala for us Asians, for example, is something that is a fault, but also something that is something that you missed. You missed something, or you just inadvertently lost sight of it or something. It's sala or kasalanan, but understood that in that context, the idea of forgiveness is easy. Whereas sin, with all the connotation that we now have, especially in theology, sin is something that is not easily forgiven or not easily set aside or just brushed off. You need to undergo a kind of a series or process by which you're able to redeem yourself or be reconciled again with the community. So the word sala may not be the appropriate word for sin if you want to make it to connote something that is heavy, that has to be punished. Okay. And then even the whole idea of the loob and the labas. For those of you who do not understand Tagalog, loob means inside and labas means outside. Now, loob, the inside and the outside in another language can be a very strict kind of a division. You're outside of the house, you're inside of the house. But when in Asia, when we talk about the loob and the labas, especially in the context of personal relationship, it is not quite as strict, because even if you are nasa labas, if you are outside, it's the border there is not as strict. The border is sometimes a little bit hazy, a little bit grayish, and that you're not exactly completely outside. But that is the way we Asians tend to look at relationship. It is some people are nasa loob, but when we say nasa loob, it's basically you're talking about a very close knit kind of a relationship, something that you would probably identify with your own family, not only with your family, but probably with your nuclear family, with your maybe your brothers and sisters, or at the most with your cousins, your first cousins. But beyond that, second cousin, third cousin, etc., it's already something that is, yes, part of the family, but still not gone. Now, this is important because when you start talking about caring for the elderly, for example, sometimes in a Western countries, once you have what do you call this? Once you have left your house, you are in a way independent. You are autonomous now. So you don't need. You are not responsible so much for the people who are left behind in your own house, especially your grandparents, your parents, or even some of your sisters. You're now independent. But in the Asian context, that is not quite so easy. You're still very, very much connected. And that is why it is difficult for us Asians to send our elderly people, our grandparents, to a nursing home, because that would be putting out or outside our relatives, the people who are close to us. So we'd rather keep our relatives, our elderly relatives, in our home, because that is how we speak of them as still being part of our own family. So this is the nuances that are so very different from one culture to another. So we're talking about the loob and the labas, the interior and the exterior, the inside and the outside. It really all depends on how people look at relationship in the what do you call this, in a particular culture. So another step that we need to do in contextualization is to distinguish between core values or traits and the surface values or traits. What Mackay refers to as example here is the idea of being connected. For example, for Asians, being connected, being in a relationship is very, very important. Tribal communities, such as you would find in Papua New Guinea, in Africa, and in other some of the more what do you call this, ancient countries that have very strong family ties. Relationship is very, very important. You just do not break your relationship with your family. If you break your relationship with your family, it's almost like killing yourself. It's almost like you are denouncing and you are putting yourself in exile. So that is something that is very very strict. Whereas when we start talking about kanya kanya, to each his own, uh, to each his own, kanya kanya. Maybe it's something that we can observe. For example, in when you go to some Western countries, when they have a feast, if you are not invited, you cannot eat. You're not even if you are there and your friend has brought you, you may not, unless of course the owner of the house you're going to will invite you to come and eat. Then you are able to eat. But if not, they will not. I remember in Belgium, when we say how many are coming for one, when you say six, there will be six. If you come, but you're seven of you or eight of you, the two will not eat. Only the six will eat, and the two will sit over there without eating. Without that is how they look at it. But for us in the Philippines, no, especially in the Philippines, and I'm sure it's in Asia. When you come to a celebration, oh, I'll bring my friend. My friend, how many friends did you bring? About 10, about 15 people. Huh? So that's why when we try to put up a feast at home, we try to prepare as much as possible because we never know exactly how many people will be coming. And more than likely, many of our friends will be bringing along some of their friends, and they will come and eat. Even if they're going to eat only a small portion, that's okay. But that is the context. See, you distinguish between what are the core values and what are the surface values. There are certain things that we say, these are all superficial things. I know the commercial. There was one commercial for the Philippine tourism. The thing about anak. You remember that commercial about anak? What is the meaning of anak? This tourist was asking, what is the meaning of anak? What is this? Anak means son or daughter or child. Okay, that's the meaning of anak. Because in the Philippines, everybody is a family, a member of a family. So even if you're a visitor, even if you're a tourist, when you come to a particular community, you are part of the family. You are anak. Okay. So I think we need to understand the proper context here. Now, the third step would be to develop and communicate. And this is the big problem because we need to find the proper words to communicate it. And it's not that easy. When you talk about loob, for example, kalooban. Kalooban. What is the meaning of kalooban? it's actually it's a lot of things. It's not something that is abstract, but it's something that you feel, you sense. So when you say loob, intellectually you may be able to explain it, but loob has to be felt. You need to feel it, because if you don't feel like you are part of the community, then you probably will not have that magandang kalooban that you would experience. Okay, so these are different steps. Now, I'm just trying to point this out to you so that when you try to reread Maga, you'll be able to understand a little bit of what she's talking about. Examples of contextualization. She gives one example, which is from the scriptures. Paul, for example, talking about God. When he was among his fellow Jews, he talked about God as Messiah. When he was with the pagans in Lystra, he talked about the living God who made heaven and earth, blessed it with rain and fruitful seasons. So maybe the pagans in Lystra were agriculture or were farmers. That's why he would talk about symbolisms of the rain and the fruitful season. When he went to Athens, we're talking about philosophers, and we're talking about people who were, disciples of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. Then Paul was saying, this statue that you have dedicated to the unknown God, this is the one who has revealed himself to us. He is the one of whom I am preaching. It is in him that we live and move and have our being. Now, three different ways of talking about God, but each one is fitted according to the culture, according to the what do you call this, the cultural sense of the people, so that what Paul would be preaching about would be understood by the people themselves. For Filipinos and Asians themselves, according to Magay, Tagapamagitan, if we talk about God, he is the one who is a kind of a negotiator between two parties. He is the one in the middle. He is the one who's talking to one and at the same time talking to the other and trying to bring the two together. This is what we call mediation. So maybe mediator, as the title that we give to God or to Jesus Christ, is something that is more apt for us because Jesus Christ, in fact, mediates between God and man and God. Now, also, so the idea, even in the word tagapamagitan, you're really talking about a kind of a relationship that is somehow it's there. It's not, the borders are not very strict, are not very sharp, but it's a flowing kind of a relationship. But the flowing kind of a relationship precisely enables this tagapamagitan, the mediator, is able to go to the one side as well as to go to the other side, and not feel like he is an outsider for the one side or the other side, but someone who can really be accepted by one side as well as accepted by the other side. Framing it within the context of unity and authenticity, in other words, there has to be a kind of a correspondence between our language and what we believe deeply in our culture, deeply in our faith. In other words, it has to be something that will speak to us authentically. If you say, okay, Jesus is this, and then it doesn't move your heart, it doesn't make you really be so enthused about Jesus, then there is something missing there. There is something missing. It has to translate not only from the intellectual level, but also into the pastoral level, the emotional level, the feeling level. So these are some of the things about contextualization. Now I am offering these ideas because these are actually what the things that we are going to be talking about, especially when we start to talk about human experience, because human experience is so diverse. What we experience here in the Philippines is diverse from what people experience in Papua New Guinea, in Australia, in Europe, in so different. But there is something there that ties us together. That's why we are called human beings. But there is something that ties us together. But if you want to make sense of, let's say, the Christian faith, it has to be understood within a context of a culture, specific culture. Otherwise, it becomes abstract and it becomes something that is probably what do you call this? Something imported from foreign lands. And for many, many centuries, that is how many people felt about Christianity in Asia, in the Philippines. It was something imported from Spain, and then we have never been able really to fully make it our own. Okay. Now, let me go. Do I still have time? I still have time, no? Because we started at quarter to 12 already after all the preliminaries. Okay. I have 45 minutes. Now, this last part is simply trying to introduce you to the method that we will be using, which is we have termed it as the post-colonial liberative methodology, and I refer you to the two works, especially when you talk about post-colonial. Thomas Rausch will tell you different levels of post-colonial methodology, and Wilfrid will tell you more about the role of theology, especially from the context of Asia, a kind of a liberative, what do you call this, theology from Asian perspective. Essentially, what we are going to be talking about in this methodology is a combination of what we call the historical critical method, you know, using history to make us understand what came before us, but also looking at our own processes like a see, judge, act process. Look at the analyzing the situation and looking at it from the context of our faith tradition, and then in the practical sense, how do we translate that? How do we translate that meaning in a practical way in our own lives? And the process of contextualization. It is post-colonial because it is more global. In other words, as much as possible, we would like to be able to do theology from our own context. But already I can tell you that you will probably be saying, why don't we speak the language in Asia? Well, the problem that we don't speak in Asia is because there are several of us who speak different languages, Asian languages, and we may not be able to understand one another. The other reason also is because even if we come from different regions here in the Philippines, we also speak very different languages. And to speak in Tagalog may not be speaking in the usual language that the Cebuanos or the people from Mindanao would speak. So may as well use English here. But what we are trying to do is try to be as non-colonial as in our language as possible. So trying to go deeply into our own Asian perspective, and that is why I have used some of the references, a good number of references from Asian authors, because it is important that we immerse ourselves in the context of theologizing from the Asian context. So post-colonial basically means, we are, what do you call this? You are more global. It has been so many centuries that we have operated basically in a theology that is basically imported from Europe. And I think it's about time that we do also theology in our own grounds, in our own roots, in our own context. This is not to disregard colonial perspectives, because in many ways they're going to be helpful to us. But it has its own place. Its own place is in the tradition that we have. But it is our obligation as people of this country, a people of this culture, to make the language of theology understandable to as many people, and especially when we start talking about people in the margins. Okay, and that is the meaning of the word liberative, because we are doing theology from a decidedly clear perspective, and our perspective is always the option for the margins. So even the way we look at the scriptures, we will have to look at it from the point of view of what it says about the margins, about the message of Jesus to the people in the margins. So people would say, you are looking at theology from the perspective of Augustine. Even if you were Augustinians, you would like to know more about theology according to Augustine. Very fine. Study Augustinianism in the novitiate. Then here we would like to study. You have chosen to study theology in SVST, so we will do the SVST with the post-liberative, or what do you call this, the theology from the margins. It is not that we disregard the others, but I think that is basically our option. And we are clear from the beginning that this is the kind of perspective. In other words, these are the eyeglasses that we are going to use in order to do theology, in order to look at scriptures, to look at tradition, and to look at theology. So that's the meaning of liberative. When we talk about post-colonial liberative theology, we generally speak about three mediations, what we call practical mediation, hermeneutical mediation, and practical mediation of the Christian community. Now, there are two practical mediation because what it really means, what is going on. What is going on now, which is what we have done actually in the first three chapters of our course, try to find out how theology is being done by yourselves and by other people. And then we go in the second part would be talking about the hermeneutical mediation already. And then later on, afterwards, we talk about practical mediation of the Christian community, which is something that is quite important. In other words, what is the role of the community in theology? What is the relationship between the magisterium and the theologians, between the community and the theologians, between the community and the leadership, the hierarchy in the church? So this is what we mean when we say practical mediation of the Christian community. Let me explain its mediation. For example, practical mediation. Our starting point is always our contemporary human experience. And why do we say that? Why do we start from our contemporary human experience? Because it is something that we know, something that we are familiar with. So we start with something that is familiar to us. So when we talk in the next chapter, when we talk about contemporary human experience, we'll have to talk about experience in 2020. I can tell you about my experience in 2005 and 2010, but that is not the same as your experience in 2020. So we would like to speak as much as possible what we are experiencing today so that whatever theology we come up with will be meaningful to our contemporaries. But also it will be good for us to study the structure of experience. When we speak about experience and interpretation, what do we really mean? What do we really mean by that? And then what are the obstacles in understanding human experience? And then why is there a need for us to commit ourselves that our experience, we have vast experience, but our focus in our experience is the option for the poor and the lives of the marginalized. That is our option. It doesn't mean, of course, that we're not going to take care of our everyday, our everyday life, practical life. We will do that. But in doing theology here, we would like to say that at least we are very clear that we are looking at the option, the context always is the option for the poor. Then in this particular mediation, we also analyze. And analysis means using the methodologies that is available to us by social sciences. So social analysis, structural analysis, historical analysis, these are the things that we will need to use in order to be able to understand what is happening. So for example, what is happening now? Very recently, there's a kind of a rumor that there will be a kind of a coup in terms of the speakership in the House of Representatives. Why is that? Is that important for us? Yes, it's important for us because it's our government, of course. And so politics and sociology, that's part of our government. But at the same time, it will have an impact on the lives of the poor. And what will be the impact that it will have the lives of the poor? And this is what social analysis will tell us. Through different kinds of hermeneutics of suspicion, for example. I just do not take hermeneutics of suspicion means I don't take everything that you say to me, word for word and literally. I need to analyze what you're saying. Where are you coming from? What is the context of what you're saying, etc. As well as hermeneutics of appreciation. In the second mediation, hermeneutical mediation, we're actually talking about what we would call the substantive material or content of our faith, the faith tradition of our faith, which is rooted in what we know as the church tradition, which is much larger. But within the church tradition, you have the scriptures, which is at the same time the what do you call this, the core of the tradition, but at the same time, it is the norm against which tradition is going to be assessed whether it is faithful to that event, the event of Jesus, or not. That's why we are able to say this one is a heretical view, this one is systematic view, because it is not consistent with what we know the scripture is telling us. So this is what we are going to be discussing in the hermeneutical mediation. So doing theology with scriptures, and there are three worlds of text. We will see that. Uh, the world of Jesus, the world of the interpreters of Jesus, and the world of the interpreter now. So there are three different worlds. And then when we look at the Bible, again, we look at the Bible, and the key to our understanding of the Bible is what Jesus says about option for the poor, about the margins. What is the role that they play in the preaching of Jesus, in the message of Jesus? What does he say about them? Now, from the practical mediation of the Christian community, here we're going to be talking about something very, very, what do you call it, specifics. In other words, how do we judge whether a particular statement by the church or by a theologian or by an ordinary person is something that is theologically sound, theologically faithful to our tradition? We will examine criteria for theological formulations. What criteria would say that they belong to what we would call church faith, or they belong to the group of beliefs that are called heresies or heretical beliefs. Also, we will be talking about Christian orthopraxis, which is basically talking about, if this is the revealed religion, how did a particular community at a particular time in a particular place receive that revelation? The reception by Christian communities, the Christians of Antioch, the Christians in Alexandria, the Christians in Europe, the Christians in Africa, the Christians in what do you call it, in the U.S., the Christians in Melanesia, the Christians in Australia, the Christians in Japan, in China, in Vietnam. How did they receive Christianity? What forms did Christianity take on in order to express its own faith in these places? And we will find that they are very, very different. And then once they are very different and very varied, how can we still say that this is still they belong to the deposit of our Christian faith? We will be talking about this then. And then practical mediation as strategies. How are we going to put this basically into praxis? In other words, into practice. Where do we find praxis in our own communities? And then, of course, the relationship about the theologians, the magisterium, the church in general. We talk about the sensus fidelium, we talk about the community as the guardian of the faith. But in the community, there are certain people who are given specific tasks. It is for the theologians to to analyze the soundness of the teaching, and it's for the church hierarchy to pronounce whether that particular teaching is faithful or not faithful. So there's a kind of a division of labor, but they are a community that works together. They have to work together. But at the same time, they have to be all continually have their ears attuned to what is happening in the lives of ordinary people. Because if they ever depart from the lives of the ordinary people, then somehow or other, they are going to be not representative of our faith, and perhaps not even faithful to our tradition. And this is where we end this particular chapter. Now, let me go back towards the pastoral magisterium. When we start talking about the community having a say on what's going on in the church. For example, the community having a say on who becomes bishop or who becomes the president of the bishops' conference. You know, it's important that the people are consulted about this. Why are they not consulted now? Aha, so there will be problems. So our course, the next three chapters, will be talking about these three different steps. Chapter 5 will talk about the human experience. C, or the practical or the social mediation. Chapter 6 will be on the Judeo-Christian tradition, the hermeneutical mediation or judge and discern. And chapter 7 will be the community and its role in theologizing, the act or the practical mediation. So this is how we are talking about the fundamental theology in the next chapters, 5, 6, and 7. When we go to number 8, we will be talking about ideas about systematic theology, how to do systematic theology. But that will be probably in December already.